Welcome to Blueprint for Efficiency. My name is Michael Puckett from the Yale Clean Energy Finance Forum, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We're excited to present the first webinar in a new series jointly hosted by the Clean Energy Finance Forum and the Council for Development Finance Agencies, the CDFA. This is the first initiative in what we expect to be a long and fruitful collaboration between these two organizations. This webinar series will focus on assessing creative revenue sources for energy efficiency and on advancing energy finance policy in the United States. Keep an eye out for invitations for the next two webinars in this series, which are scheduled for April 7th and May 5th. Today's presentation is being brought to you by the team at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment's Blueprint for Efficiency, which is in its 6th year of providing public webinars emphasizing the latest trends and opportunities for energy efficiency. Each presentation is recorded and available through the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website and the Blueprint for Efficiency iTunes U page. A link to download the slides from today's presentation has also been posted in the chat window. I'll hand it over shortly to Jason Rittenberg, Director of Research and Advisory Services at the CDFA, who will provide a brief overview of the work being done at the CDFA around energy financing and the motivation for this webinar series. He'll also be introducing our presenters today, Doug Lamb from McGuire Woods and Colin Rowan from the United Fund Advisors. Finally, I would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have, and we will direct them to our speakers at the conclusion of the talk. You can type those questions directly into the GoToMeeting chat window. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Jason.
Great, thank you for that introduction. My name is Jason Rittenberg with CDFA, and we also are very excited to be talking with all of you today about energy finance and some of the creative tools and in some ways some of the very traditional tools that can be used to do financing in this space. So after I speak, Doug Lamb, partner with McGuire Woods, will be speaking, and then Colin, with the principal with United Fund Advisors, will be talking. And all three of us today are going to be talking about different facets of the development finance toolbox and how that can come to bear on energy financing, whether that's clean energy or energy efficiency. So I wanted to start off by kind of framing this conversation by presenting a few of the entities and some of the tools that can be used in this space. You know, in many ways, the tools I'm talking about are old hat. If you're familiar with infrastructure finance or general economic development, you might know about many of these programs. But at CDFA, what we've found over the past several years as we've become increasingly involved in the energy finance space is that many people aren't aware of the way that traditional financing tools can be used for energy. People tend to be more focused on just what we call the energy branded programs that explicitly say they're about energy finance. And so I wanted to talk through today some of those entities that exist both inside and outside of that energy context that can be useful, and then how their tools can be useful as well. So where development finance programs really all come from are finance authorities. These are organizations that are located at the state and local government throughout the country that have the ability to utilize economic development finance tools. There are literally thousands, and actually tens of thousands of entities in the United States that can issue bonds and or operate other development finance programs that we'll talk about. Many of these entities have so many authorities that are given to them by state and local governments throughout the country that they have all the same powers of the green banks that you hear so much discussion about in this space. They can do things like issue bonds, they can operate PACE programs, they can run a special financing district, they can do loan programs, all, again, those same things that you hear talked about with the green bank, but they can do it from your traditional economic development finance entity. You might see them under the name of, this might be a special division of development under a city government. It might be a port authority, it might be a state development agency, it might be something very targeted and sophisticated called a finance authority, or maybe even a really robust community development financial institution can be the entity in your area that has these powers. And oftentimes there's going to be more than one available that can operate these programs where you are. At the end of the day, these authorities operate something that we call the Development Finance Toolbox. And what we're talking about with Development Finance Toolbox is a set of programs that can operate across the development finance spectrum. So on that graph you see in front of you right now, you've got a spectrum here from government projects to established industry businesses to development, redevelopment projects, small businesses and micro businesses, and then entrepreneurs. So these are projects and businesses that have really very different types of needs from each other, and fittingly, they can't use the same type of program. You know, bonds are most effective. You see there in Bedrock tools, bonds are the main Bedrock tool. Those are really effective for government projects, infrastructure projects, airports, docks, manufacturing, established industries, again, like manufacturers, development, redevelopment projects, doing the infrastructure, even those small and light infrastructure around a mixed-use district or multifamily housing. Those types of projects are really well suited for bonds because they provide large pieces of debt. And Doug Lamb, when he talks in a moment, is going to get much more into that heavy debt piece in the Bedrock tools that I'm talking about here. Targeted tools and tax increment financing, if you've heard of that, and special district financing really comes into play under targeted tools. And these are really effective for helping established industries, for helping development projects and redevelopment projects. They can be narrowed into a specific business, one specific building, or be district-wide and help provide a very specific type of financing that can help certain types of development, certain types of infrastructure, and other project costs, including energy, be offset with effective and efficient use of public funds. Investment tools can include equity and can include tax credits as well as venture or other equity investments. And those are really flexible types of projects and cover a wide range. In some cases, you're starting to see them for infrastructure. You see lots of equity, of course, with entrepreneurs and small businesses, but they can also come into play for established industry and development as well. So it's important that someplace in your community has some sort of access to an investment tool, whether that's a tax credit program, and Colin Rowan on the line is going to talk about tax credits and other types of equity tools a little bit later in today's call. And then access capital lending tools are also very effective. These can really go across the entire range as well, depending on the type of tool that you're talking about. But a lot of lending programs are looking specifically at small businesses, micro businesses, entrepreneurs, and they can also be very powerful in the energy space. And then when CDFA is talking about support tools as part of the development finance toolbox, we're talking about federal programs, grants, abatements, and other programs that don't fit quite as nicely into the other categories here, but can really support the financing of a project. Now, one finance authority does not need to have access to all of these programs, but it is really important that within the community there be access to all of these tools. And if that can happen, then your community can support a wide range of projects, including energy projects, no matter what type of entity is looking to do them, whether it's a major infrastructure energy project or a major infrastructure project that's going to have an energy component to it, whether that's manufacturing looking to improve efficiency or to do some sort of combined heat and power, for example, or a redevelopment project that's going to have an efficiency component to it as well. So some of the specific finance authorities that you can look to as great examples that use those traditional finance tools that I discussed in overview and then put them towards an energy purpose are listed here on this page. Ohio Port Authorities are a really powerful creation of state statute that allow a local county to create a port authority. Now, the county doesn't need to have a true port. It doesn't need to have an airport, let alone a seaport. Really, the port authority can operate like a development finance entity. It can issue bonds. It can manage a tax increment finance district. It can run loan programs. It can run tax credits. And Ohio has 5 to 6 really strong port authorities and several others that are more one-directional. And they do things like run PACE districts in Ohio. Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority in particular runs a very robust PACE program. It's been a DOE Better Buildings grantee. And because of that, they're able to get really involved in pretty sophisticated ways in the energy space in the state through what was otherwise a traditional financing entity. The California State Treasurer's Office is broken down into several different branches, but 2 of them, the California Pollution Finance Control Authority and the California, I'm going to get all the words wrong, Alternative Energy and Transportation Finance Authority, I believe it's CATFA, they are able to do very, very robust programming. Between those entities, they operate PACE, they operate loan loss reserve funds, they operate a small loan loss reserve pooled loan program called a CAP program, and they can really be a sophisticated financing entity because of all those powers that they have. New Jersey Economic Development Authority, the state's go-to finance and economic development agency, is now operating a special set of CDBG funds, Community Development Block Grant funds, from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they were able to use those funds to create their own version of a green bank that's targeted at doing energy efficiency and other energy improvements for low to moderate income areas. And then, as I mentioned, community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, are really pretty typical community development banks, credit unions, but several of them have been able to find ways to get very involved in the energy space, particularly Solar and Energy Loan Fund in Florida, and up in Washington you have CRAFT 3. So two tools I want to tease out in particular, because Doug and Colin won't address them directly necessarily in their talks, are tax districts and loan funds. So first, talk about tax districts. There are a couple different kinds of tax districts that are authorized in various states. Each state has its own authorizing legislation that affects what type of districts are allowed and what they can finance. But in general, tax increment finance and or special improvement districts are allowed in almost every state in the country. And what these programs do in different ways is either capture property tax value and use it to pay redevelopment costs, or add special taxes on top of an area and use those fees to pay redevelopment costs. And as a result of using these programs, there are a couple different ways this can relate to energy finance. For example, we've seen special districts be used to provide more efficient streetlights for corridors. Some really interesting projects happening up in Michigan using this type of authority, and other cities across the country are starting to take note and see what they can do. You can put a district in place, you can use the financing costs to pay for LED lights, or as a district is put in and redevelopment occurs, you can replace your existing streetlight infrastructure with this more efficient LED-based streetlights. Solar backup for intersections. I know because resiliency is starting to be more of an issue for communities throughout the country, we've had talks with a couple of different regional planning commissions that are interested in having more solar backups so that during some sort of power outage, the community doesn't have such a traffic issue and people can still get safely through intersections. Also possibilities for community solar and combined heat and power using these tools as well. Loan funds, of course, very flexible tools. Revolving loan funds involve having a pool of capital that establishes the loan fund in the initial place. That loan fund is then used to make loans, and principal and interest payments repay the loan fund. And so over the course of time, the program can completely recycle and oftentimes even grow over its life as more loans are made and as they're paid back. Similar to a loan program, same type of principle can come into play to create funding for a credit enhancement model, such as for a loan loss reserve, or it's called a collateral support program, or even a guarantee program. So regardless of the exact structure of the loan fund that you're talking about, some sort of program that provides dedicated funding for businesses, for redevelopment, and for energy costs, whether that's energy efficiency so businesses can go in and become more efficient, or whether that's green energy so businesses can help offset the cost of upgrading their energy source to solar or wind or another technology. These programs can be very flexible. They can help businesses access capital when their banks may not be comfortable with the transaction, but they can still be very safe overall, and they can help these projects move forward. So a handful of examples of different loan fund and credit enhancement models that exist and are targeted towards energy or small businesses and can be used for energy are CalCap, the California Pollution Control Finance Authority I mentioned earlier, operates this program, basically creates a pooled loan loss reserve fund that operates across many small loans, works with bank, community bank, and community development financial institution partners throughout the state to reach a large number of small businesses. And the Ohio Port Authorities, which again I mentioned earlier, have a loan loss reserve program that was actually started with QECB funds and is now able to provide a backstop to bonds and PACE programs and other programs that are going to finance energy efficiency improvements throughout the state. And so it's a really creative model. It's getting a lot of leverage and going to help, hopefully at least, a large number of projects go forward. That program is just getting off the ground here, and we're excited to see what can happen with it. And some of you might be aware of the WHEEL program that has been put into place in Pennsylvania, and it is using, again, a loan program to really help residents get more efficiency, get loans that are low cost for efficiency. It has a great credit backstop model to it, and so it's able to make unsecured loans that are secured at the fund level and make very affordable financing going forward for a lot of customers in an important state. So, this is really just an overview of a lot of different models that are available. I know in other talks, Doug and Colin, and in future webcasts, we're going to get into a lot more details, but I wanted to provide today some of the breadth of what's possible for energy financing through the long-standing development finance models that have been around. Happy to answer any questions at the end, and right now I'm going to turn things over to Doug Lamb with McGuire Woods.
Thanks, Jason. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. And I am loading up my screen right now. Let's see here. And when it's, I have 10:20 right now, so what do I have till about 10:35 or so?
That sounds great, yeah.
Okay, great. And I think what Jason covered was tremendously helpful in terms of where I will be going with my presentation. My name is Doug Lamb. I am a partner with McGuire Woods in Richmond, Virginia, although not there today, but and I work in the energy area, and I've worked on a variety of energy projects. What Jason touched upon that is critical when looking at putting together a project or program, trying to get financing for any of these types of projects that can run the full gamut from energy efficiency to traditional sort of energy projects, whether it's just natural gas or some sort of electricity production from traditional sources or renewable energy production. One of the things to look at closely is to start with the locality, and then the state, and then the federal level, because there are, as Jason touched upon, their program in each state that are different and can be tremendously beneficial to the ultimate project. Now, also, one of those considerations always to any of these projects is what we see a lot on the finance side is just trying to choose which one is the most efficient vehicle and to keep it simple. Oftentimes you'll see a lot of folks want to layer in a bunch of different subsidies to improve the rate of return on the project. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on all the project planning factors and how long you have to pull the project off. But that's one of the things we should touch on as we move through this, because as one starts to put a project together and to evaluate what they're going to do, they're really going to want to talk to the local economic development folks, talk to their professionals, figure out what the time horizon for a project is, what the real purpose of the project is, what they're trying to create ultimately, and how long they have to do it, and also figure out who should own the project. Is it a situation where it's a public-private sort of scenario where maybe you have private ownership and a lot of public involvement and on the contractual side, or is it a pure public situation with very minimal private involvement except for maybe contractors, or wholly private? And those sorts of questions will lead one down a variety of different paths, and I think maybe what Colin can touch upon or will touch upon, and which is some of the other vehicles out there that are maybe potentially more on the purely non-governmental ownership side, although I will touch upon the bond mechanisms that are in place for both governmental and non-governmental ownership. But when you walk away from this, you'll realize that some of the agencies Jason mentioned, some of the products I mentioned, and that Colin mentions, they all are usually interwoven together in some of these larger, more sophisticated projects. And there are a variety of folks that at both the local, state, national levels and the governmental, non-governmental side that are very attuned to how these things work, and that's a critical piece of moving forward. One slide I put in here is just to always try to think about what the goals and the interests are of the owners and the investors, to really figure out who wants what. I think having those sort of discussions early on is really important in terms of achieving success. And a lot of times these projects will involve everybody, getting a little bit, and not one person getting everything. And if that sort of viewpoint is taken generally towards getting these done, it's usually a lot better situation for everyone. Some of the energy-related, if you will, governmental programs that are on the bond side are either tax exempt, where the interest is exempt to the income of the holder of the instrument, or the sort of tax credit bonds that have existed over a period of time. I've addressed really the clean renewable energy bonds, the qualified energy conservation bonds, and the qualified zone academy bonds, because for more or less the school construction bonds, although eligible for schools and charter schools, and are largely rolled off to, and I'm really not seeing a lot of those anymore. But this chart, this page 5, is really intended to address kind of the differences between them, and really to highlight some factors of in your planning stage. Who's going to issue the obligation? Who's going to own it? Some of the approvals that are required, the type of subsidy that's delivered. Is the subsidy something that is meaningful to the project? Is it something worth the time trying to get? And do you have to issue the obligations before construction? Can you issue them after construction? All those are timing considerations that one should take into account for any of the types of programs and projects. And the energy transactions on the bond side go from the prepay structure, where you're issuing an obligation to prepay for the power or the gas that's delivered, to sort of output facility transactions, where you are issuing from for a facility where the power is bought and sold to another entity, and then the energy conservation bonds, which are very flexible in terms of governmental or non-governmental ownership, and the new CREBs, which are basically restricted to 3 categories of ownership: co-ops, public power, and governmental entities. And without straying from energy efficiency too far, you will see a lot of these instruments, particularly QECBs, QZABs, and tax-exempt bonds or leases used for energy efficiency transactions on the governmental level. It's very common, and most of the larger banks and regional banks have those programs. These are some rules regarding output facilities. I'll let you all read through that. These slides will be provided to you later. And I've listed here kind of in the industry, they're called private activity bonds. They're generally bonds that where the ownership or use is held in predominantly in a non-governmental entity. You find them a lot in utility, so you'll see a lot of landfill, solid waste, sewage facility. But there's a whole category of these. All these that are listed here on the slide 8 relate to categories of bonds that might be useful for an energy-related project. There are lots of limitations on these because they're obviously providing a subsidy, and the subsidy is intended to be targeted. So anybody going into these needs to be aware of those limitations, and that they will have to live with them for a period of time while the bonds are outstanding. But there is a wide range of instruments available worth digging into. And these private activity bonds can be used in concert with some of the kind of for-profit tax credits, as opposed to the tax credit bonds that I mentioned. They removed some of the restrictions in the Recovery Act a few years ago to allow some double dipping there, and you'll find that could be a consideration when you're putting a project together, whether maybe that can be taken advantage of. This slide really highlights that the new CREBs are renewable energy producing facilities, so wind, solar, biomass, hydro, things like that. And the QECBs are a much broader range of projects, everything from that covers the new CREBs projects to energy efficiency to research expenditures and various programs and energy conservation, and a broad category called the Green Community Program, which is, I think folks are getting more and more comfortable with and how that works, because it, in part, they're wanting to get comfortable with it because it does accept it's exempt from the 30% allocation requirement that no more than that at least 70% of the allocation for a QECB at a state be used for governmental projects. And so that's gaining a lot of popularity. I think we're seeing more of those. Just a couple quick things on these tax credit bonds. Again, we call them tax credit bonds, but they're actually eligible for a direct pay subsidy. If you're familiar with some of the for-profit tax credit bonds where they allow the grants to be paid in lieu of the tax credit, it's the same sort of situation where the issuer of the bond will receive a direct pay subsidy based upon the amount of interest paid. And when calculating the amount of interest, one needs to be aware that for these QECBs and CREBs, it's 70% of the tax credit rate and that you use, and then they're also subject to sequestration still. So some important things in the planning phase. This slide really gets into, this is slide 10, and really gets into the qualified conservation purposes for QECBs. Again, a wide-ranging group of things. Candidly, what we've seen most of the QECBs used for are in the first column on the left, which are reduction of energy consumption in public-owned buildings, and the green community programs. I haven't seen one for a research project, and I guess the mass commuting facilities, I could see that being done, although I I'm not aware personally of one of those. But there's some folks out there that maintain a really good database of where QECBs have been used. I think that Energy Consortium is one group that maintains a listing of these, and it's worth looking that up to get it. They have a good booklet of what's been used on the QECB side. Real quickly, because this has been a recent topic, the new CREBs, which had allocations go out in, I guess, 2009 or 2010, I guess, subject to a 3-year use requirement. Those allocations that weren't used were just made available to be reallocated. You can see that's a big number, about $1.4 billion, and there are different methodologies for obtaining the allocation. This notice, there are several, CDFA's done several presentations on this, and there's some materials they have available that go into detail about the notice, but the IRS notice itself is very detailed. Just something to be aware of, because that's something that's going on right now if you have a project that's a renewable energy electricity producing facility. And what we've done on these last couple of slides is try to compare and contrast tax-exempt QZABs, new CREBs, and QECBs, just some of the elements of them. And I think these are the types of things that if you want to have a kind of desktop tool that you want to be able to look at real quickly to make sure you're thinking about them correctly, they're available. That's what this is for. Certainly, just like any of these presentations, you should always consult your advisors about what some of this means, because it's really condensed for chart form. And as I flip through it, you can see what's in here. Now, what I'm going to close with are and to hand off to Colin, are some of these other incentives that are out there, and there are lots of them. Jason touched on all the development programs at the local and state levels, and And there are a variety of ways these incentive packages could put together, from whether it's a TIF or a special assessment. You're seeing PACE develop now, which is sort of a special assessment TIF type structure, just to, for the sake of illustration and ease. Lots of payment in lieu of tax arrangements at the state and local level. On the federal level, you have the production investment tax credits. Now, obviously, some of these are rolling off or subject to limitation, or haven't been renewed, and have very, very specific requirements, and have very specific limitations, particularly when involving governmental programs. So you want to be real careful about mixing these up. But new markets is an area where you see a lot of people try to use those with other programs, whether they're state local incentives or other types of bond programs. And then lastly, of course, for any energy project, and whether it's a broad category, the USDA and the DOE, Department of Energy, have just vast amounts of resources and programs for a variety of different, whether it's biomass, biofuel, whether it's stuff that is not commercially proven yet. It's kind of a demonstration project. And then recently, the White House has announced its Rural Infrastructure Opportunity Fund, which is more of in the nature of a public-private partnership. So, with that, I'll be happy to answer questions at the end, and I thank you for your time and attention. I'd like to hand it over to Colin.
Great, thanks. I'm going to just pull up my screen here. Is that screen up and available for everybody?
Yes, Colin, looks good.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks everybody for participating, and thanks to the Yale Clean Energy Finance Forum and CDFA for inviting me to speak to you all today. I'm going to try and keep this pretty brief and focus in a little bit on probably sort of two main areas: tax credit-based finance, and hand-in-hand with that, project-level finance. So a lot of the programs you've already heard about can be used to finance various programs, energy efficiency programs, research programs. The tools I'm going to talk about are more project-based, so supporting the construction of hard assets, and typically larger-scale projects. We've funded energy projects that are non-utility scale, $5 million to $10 million or larger, and then new markets, which I'll get into in some detail, typically used for projects $7 or $8 million or larger. So with that as a framework, just real quick, we're based in Portland, Oregon. United Fund Advisors. We're a financial services company that provides tax credit finance for projects. We've got about $2 billion of assets under management, and a portion of that is energy projects. A lot of it is using new market tax credit to support both energy and non-energy projects. Clients include a whole list of folks I won't bore you with, but you can browse through these slides if you want. I'm going to skip over services so we can get to the meat of things. So new market tax credit financing, some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not be. It's a competitive program run by the Treasury Department, and the overriding goal is to stimulate private investment in low-income communities, period. What that means is you can have a lot of flexibility in the types of projects that can be financed. What it also means, though, and this is very important, is that new market tax credits yields about 20% of the capital stack that you're looking at for a project. So for, say, a $10 million wind project, about $2 million will be net into the project as a source of funds to support it. It's low-cost, flexible capital, but there's, and it can be debt or equity, but there are particular considerations you need to think about when considering new market tax credit financing for a project. There's a 7-year creditor compliance period, and we'll get into twin deals with ITCs, which have a 5-year compliance period. So there's a additional 2-year tail on new markets where you're reporting on compliance requirements to the Treasury Department. You've got to have the other 80% of the funding. So you've got to be able to demonstrate that the balance of the funding needed to complete your project is not just available theoretically, but committed. There can be challenges combining the tax credit equity with traditional commercial financing because of the 7-year compliance period and some things that are asked of lenders that they often don't like. And it's a highly competitive program with a lumpy funding cycle. So the awards are typically given on an annual basis. We expect awards this year to be announced sometime in the June timeframe. And then it's sort of a feeding frenzy as projects are trying to lock up allocation from folks like ourselves and others who often get awards to get closed sometimes within 2015. And then it's up for reauthorization, so it's not permanent legislation, so there's uncertainty going forward. There's all sorts of projects you can fund with new markets. Here are just some high-level examples, but it includes renewables. We've funded biofuels and wind projects with new markets, and solar projects have been done, although the solar projects that we financed were just ITC-only projects, investment tax credits, which are related to the development of solar projects. Not to scare you, but just, again, you can refer to this, and I'm happy to have my information provided. Folks can follow up with me, but this is what a typical new market tax credit structure looks like. And at the top of the structure, you've got your funding sources, your lender, and your tax credit investor. All that capital is then aggregated into an investment fund, which goes down into a community development entity, or a CDE, such as the one that we run, which then makes the investment or loan or loans into what's referred to as the Qualic B. That's the project. That's the borrower. So the investment fund and the CDE are really pass-through entities that the New Markets Program forces to be inserted into what would otherwise be a typical funding structure with debt and equity coming in. So issues with pairing, and I say HTC, ITC, and MTC, historic tax credits, investment tax credits, new market tax credits. It would also apply for production tax credits. There's technical issues, but what I think folks need to be really aware of is that there's also sort of subjective considerations that you really need to think about. Because new market tax credits are competitive, groups like ourselves need to underwrite to the community impacts of the projects we're financing. So we want to see really good quality jobs getting created or maintained in the low-income community, provision of goods or services, which in the case of energy projects could be energy efficiency programs. It could be the production of renewable energy, which is either lowering ratepayers' cost of energy or maybe supporting a municipality or even a nonprofit. I'll get into a case study that looks at that in a moment. Housing, other benefits for residents of a low-income community, and then environmentally sustainable outcomes. So renewable production can kind of hit the right boxes, but at the end of the day, folks that have allocation really want to know how are low-income people in their community benefiting from the project that's going to be supported with new markets. Case study I want to talk about real quick, just because it's kind of the prototypical new markets ITC or PTC project is up in Aberdeen, Washington. It's the west coast of the Olympic Peninsula. It's a wind farm that was put in place by a nonprofit agency up there. They got a major grant from the state of Washington, had some additional sources that came in, and then used both new markets and investment tax credits to get the facility up and running. They provide food bank services, healthcare services, job training and placement services, housing services to low Olympic Peninsula. So a really unique but fantastic combination of energy production and community impact. Could somebody mute their phone? A lot of background noise there. What I'm going to do, I'm getting a ton of feedback.
Muted.
Or somebody else. There we go.
No, that's not you. Yep.
Okay, looks like we're clear. I'm going to keep going here and try and wrap up in just a few minutes. So this structure is not being presented to scare you away from twin deals. It's really just to demonstrate that there is a lot of complexity when you're dealing with tax credit finance, and when you're combining two programs, it can get even more complex. In this case, there were 2 new markets allocatees, and therefore you see the 2 sort of parallel columns in the middle with investment fund 1 and 2 and sub-CD 1 and 2. And then off on the side, you've got a master tenant structure, and that's typical for investment tax credit and production tax credit deals where you're bringing in an outside investor to buy the credits. But this is a very typical twin structure. It's not as complicated as it looks. 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have said that, but I think folks have generally become pretty comfortable with how these structures operate. The triangles are pass-through entities, and so, again, if you collapse this whole thing down and get the pass-through entities out, you're really just looking at the original funding sources and the borrower, what's labeled the qualic B here. Considerations for investment tax credits, and this would really apply for production tax credits as well. Ongoing extension of legislation similar to new markets. These energy tax credit programs are not permanent, and so there's uncertainty as to the future, which means you've got a choppy tax credit market, meaning investors sometimes aren't that interested, particularly in smaller deals. It's a 1-year credit with a 5-year compliance period, so the good news is you often see funding come in right up front, but then you've got 5 years of compliance where you've got to be able to show that whatever your energy producing facility is going to remain up and running by and large for that 5-year period. So the tax credit investors are looking for strong operators, strong guarantors on those projects. Similar to new markets, investment tax credits, production tax credits are gap fillers. You don't get the full capital stack. You're looking at 20 to 25% of the capital, and you often need to bridge finance to that tax equity because it probably won't come in on day one. So that's a real high-level overview. I want to leave time for some questions, whether they're related to my presentation or any of the others. I think what I would say, though, in summary, is that with tax credit projects, again, you've got to have reasonable scale on the project. You can theoretically have public or private ownership of the entity. If it's public ownership, you're probably going to have to set up some sort of a nonprofit or some sort of private entity to hold and operate the assets through some sort of agreement with the public agency, but you can do it. There are ways to structure that. We funded a wind project in Corpus Christi that was with the Port of Corpus Christi, but they've struck an agreement with a private developer to get this demonstration wind project up and running within the port. And so there's different creative ways you can structure it and partner up to get these things done with tax credits, particularly if you're on the public side. If you're looking to twin new markets, you got to step back and ask the question, what are the community impacts from this project? Producing renewable energy is fantastic and noble, but that's typically not enough to get new market tax credits in. You got to have some interesting public-private connection, some connection to the low-income residents of the community. The one other thing I would say is more and more people are talking about EB5 financing for largely real estate projects, but I think for major infrastructure projects as well. And the couple things I would say about EB5, we've got some experience with it and have a regional center up and running in New York, Newark, and Philadelphia. With EB5 capital, it's foreign capital coming in. They're complex structures, but if you have a credit-worthy sponsor behind the deal, a public agency, major hospital, things of that nature, infrastructure can get done, and it's something that you may want to consider, particularly if it's a larger scale project. With that, I'm going to wrap up and turn it back to the moderators to take any questions you all might have. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. So we have some good questions already lined up, but I would remind everyone that if you have anything that comes to mind or anything you want answered, please enter it into the chat window, and we'll make sure to put it to the presenters. So the first question we have comes from Albury, and it is directed for Colin. And the question is around how you see regulatory uncertainty, particularly around the PTC and the ITC affecting the market for renewable energy financing. And in particular, what you expect, whether you have any inkling as to what to expect to the ITC going forward.
Yeah, there's, I think, two areas of regulatory uncertainty. One is sort of purely a tax code issue. Some of you may be familiar with the historic boardwalk ruling that was passed down a couple of years ago, which sent the historic tax credit market and those who are active in that space sideways for a couple of years because the nature of the structure in a particular project in Connecticut, not connected to Yale, was challenged by the IRS, and that caused deal structures and deal economics to really get altered in the historic tax credit world. Things are back on track. Deals are getting done. Tax counsel is comfortable with the structures that have been arrived at. But with any tax credit program, you've got that regulatory risk that suddenly the service or Treasury Department is going to come in and basically change the rules, change the structures based on what they're seeing in the marketplace. So that's one level of risk, and that can be dealt with and gets dealt with as you're structuring your deal. The second risk is the risk that was referred to in the question directly, which is the risk of program renewal. For these programs that aren't permanent legislation, they become political footballs, and I'm sure you all have seen these things or heard of these things coming up for discussion as tax policy is debated in Washington. I don't have any insight, sadly, as to what the future of ITC and PTC credits are. The one thing I will say is they are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small programs with a lot of strong advocacy behind them. So the little insight that I get is a feeling that these programs will continue into the future indefinitely, likewise with new markets. But I say that with a huge asterisk next to it because you just never know what's going to drop off as Congress is chopping and cutting various programs. So not a very satisfying answer, but that's all I've got right now.
Okay, thanks for that. The next question comes from Steve, and he wanted to know, I guess, touching on what Jason said in his introduction, what the role of green banks and specifically strategies used by green banks such as PACE financing could play both on the bond side and more generally in terms of renewable energy financing.
Yeah, I'll start with that one, Elise. This is Jason. So I think that's a good question. When you're talking about the strategies that green banks can play and the role that they can have in financing, so you do see entities that are, in some cases, maybe officially a green bank, although I know that there are a pretty small number that consider themselves to be, using quotation marks or capital letters, green bank. But some of those entities do have bond capability. So, of course, the main green bank that people point to is the one in Connecticut. And so the Connecticut Green Bank does have the ability to issue bonds. And they can do that to support PACE. They can support a larger PACE portfolio by taking out kind of a big chunk of funding to run that PACE program, and then bonds have a role there in setting up that capital. In other cases, an actual green bank or just one of the development entities that I talked about that wants to be involved in energy projects and using bond financing, they've got a wide variety of options. So I believe Doug was talking about the exempt facilities bonds or tax-exempt private activity bonds, and those can be used for things like airports and docks and mass transit facilities, multifamily housing, manufacturers. So those are all water facilities as well, water treatment. Those are all major facilities that take a large amount of capital to finance and to have constructed. And so to the extent that those facilities are interested in doing things like making efficiency upgrades or installing solar or combined heat and power, biomass, whatever it may be, bonds can be issued directly to those facilities to help provide lower financing costs on installing those clean energy facilities onto those locations. So those are some good potential users. I know in Toledo, one of the wastewater treatment plants up there has taken advantage of, I believe they did a solar panel installation. There are other places in the country that have done it as well. Also, exempt facility bonds directly can be used for biomass and for, I think it's central heat and power, combined heat and power as well. They can be used directly for those facilities. Doesn't matter what type of other building or purpose that they're being put to. You can just issue a private activity bond for biomass, for example. So I think that answers it. Basically, bonds can be integral to bonds. To a green bank. They should be one of the tools that they're using because they can provide big chunks of capital at one time. And Doug, you might have additional thoughts as well, of course.
No, the only thought I would add to that, Jason, is that to your point about the breadth of the bonds, the there are a lot of projects that get done as bond issues without a federal subsidy involved. In other words, they're done for they're done through their traditional bonding mechanisms of a state without a federal subsidy attached to it, and that's because there might be state and local benefits available bestowed upon by virtue of issuing that bond. And there are lots, there's structures that will be put into place using that, including sort of lease structures and other structures that transfer ownership into a governmental entity to eliminate taxation. That would be the thing I would add on to it, to what you said, Jason.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate that, and particularly for people who probably haven't paid as much attention as you have. And part of the reason for that, you mentioned you can pair it with other state and local benefits, but then also in the interest rate environment that we have right now, the benefit of that federal tax exemption isn't as large as it's been historically. And so I think, and again, you can chime in if this is wrong, but I think that's even more common that people are doing bonds without that federal tax exemption because the rates are so close anyhow.
Yeah, no, I think that's generally right.
Great. Good answers there. Well, the next question comes from John, and it's directed for Doug. And the question is, could you talk about some of the unique challenges that exist for either energy efficiency or renewable energy bonds as distinct from other more traditional types of bonds?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the unique challenges of energy efficiency projects always has to do with the timing of and the matching of the savings versus the debt service and the type of facility it's going into. Oftentimes you'll see projects where the payout on the efficiency is shorter than what they want to amortize the debt, so it can present some challenges there, and working with some of the energy service companies out there that are particularly adept at trying to structure these projects so that they generate savings that essentially pay the debt service, and also meet a variety of state rules or requirements about how those savings have to be structured in order that a bond issue can, or any sort of obligation can be issued on a state or local level for that. Those, I would see the matching of that savings and revenue, or debt service rather, is a critical piece there on the energy efficiency side. Clearly, as pace develops on energy, across a variety of different platforms, whether it's renewable or energy efficiency, it'll be interesting to see how that works on the commercial side as well, as local governmental entities set up programs to allow for assessments or what have you to be pledged for commercial projects, and the matching of those revenues, and whether commercial entities will want to have as long an amortization period as maybe a governmental entity, whether their budget concerns are different. So I could see those as being future challenges there. On the renewable side, I would really point to the fact a comment Colin made about scalability. One of the issues you see on a lot of these projects is the size of it and the funding, the sources of funding for it. There's not a lot of familiarity in a lot of places with solar or wind at the governmental level, just in terms of the finance side. The engineers may be very experienced with it, and so oftentimes the challenges are just those kind of two different mindsets meeting and trying to get together on a project. I think in the last 5 to 10 years, you've seen a monumental evolution and in terms of understanding how these projects work and what they can do. One of the key areas we're seeing a lot on the utility side is just the kind of biogas world. So whether it's water, wastewater, or even kind of solid waste utilities, trying to figure out how to generate a revenue stream or save, lower their expense profile by capturing some of these resources and reusing them. And, I would say that, the big challenge there in a lot of those is just the size of the project and whether or not you can put something together and have the time and attention bringing the third-party professionals in. I think that's a real reason why when folks put these projects together, it's real important to try to bring in folks that have done them before to try to address those issues. So those challenges can be overcome, particularly as to scalability. But those would be the two.
Great, thanks for that. So we are running out of time, but I think we have time for 2 more questions. First one comes from Stuart for Colin. There was a mention of a reasonable scale of projects. And Stuart was wondering what, in terms of dollar values, is this reasonable scale when it comes to tax credit and bond financing?
I can speak on the tax credit side. I might defer to one of the other panelists on the bond side. For new markets, typically you're looking at $7 million of total project costs or larger. Anything below that, you really start to dilute the benefit because of some of the fixed costs that are incurred in getting the deals closed. The one caveat I would throw in, if you have a highly impactful project that's smaller than that, less than 5 is really tough, but $5 to $7 million, where you can really draw a bright line to the benefits to a low-income person, that can get done. And I would say on the energy side, it's probably similar. Larger than 10 is preferred. It's hard to get the tax equity for deals that are smaller than 10 million in total project cost. It's possible if all the other pieces are in place, a big, strong guarantee and a good credit-worthy developer. But those are the sort of general parameters I would offer. On the bond side, I don't know, Doug, if you have insight you can share.
Yeah, and that is goes to really the ownership question. I mean, I've seen a lot of very small, purely governmental projects get done on the bond side because it's easier to potentially just to include them in a variety of other mechanisms. It's the scalability issue really becomes when it's there's some sort of public-private, that maybe there's private ownership involved, and it really has to be a bigger project. And I don't know that I can speak to what this, the specific number would be. But when it's a corporate entity or non-governmental entity doing a bond for a project, I would say typically they don't want to really dip below $7.5 million unless there are other things going on beside that bond that allow it to allow the time and expense of putting it together to make sense. So, I hate to draw bright lines, but I think anytime you're looking below $7.5 million, you should start figuring out how you're going to pay for it and over a period of time, and whether it really makes sense from that standpoint. And I, largely would be deferential to any sort of financial advisor on that. That's more of a business sort of question than a legal question.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, so we are out of time, so this will be the last question. And it's posed by David for Jason, I think. Is there a good resource that describes the different finance authorities throughout the country?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's a good one online. Certainly if you go to our website, cdfa.net, we have an online resource database that includes resources on a wide variety of finance tools. You'll be able to find information on all the different agencies that I mentioned and quite a few others on our site. I think probably the best resource I can think of that's going to describe the different agencies and the types of programs different agencies offer is a book that we have called the Development Finance Practitioner's Guide. But I'm sure we have an online one. If you want to follow me with email, I'm sure I can send you something. The types of entities I'm talking about, state-level agencies and local-level agencies, And so if you just kind of look around in your community, they tend not to be too hard to find if you start Googling. But if you want to reach out to me, I can help you connect to some good specific resources.
Great, thanks for that. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Jason, Doug, and Colin for a wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank everyone for dialing in and listening in and participating in what has been a really entertaining and really enlightening discussion. I'd also like to remind everyone that today's talk will be available online through the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website. Please also keep an eye out for the upcoming Blueprint for Efficiency webinars, including our presentation next Tuesday, which will actually touch on a lot of similar topics. The theme is the development of secondary markets for energy efficiency loans. And we'll actually be covering a lot of these bond issuances that Doug mentioned. So this is Michael from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment saying so long from New Haven, Connecticut.